In this episode, you'll discover why life and career transitions trigger self-doubt and what to do before you make your next move. Welcome to the Midlife Reinvention Podcast, a podcast helping women in career and life transitions achieve clarity on their next steps so they can transform uncertainty into an energizing next chapter. I'm your host, Kavita Ahuja, and the founder of It's My Time Now Coaching. If you're wondering what's next in your career or life, you are in the right place. Through solo and guest episodes, you'll gain practical tips, tools, and inspiration to help you uncover blocks, gain confidence, and be, do, and have what you want. I rediscovered myself after the age of 50, and I know you can too. It's my time now to help you do just that. I'm so excited you're here. Let's dive in. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Midlife Reinvention Podcast. And welcome to March. I hope you're doing really well and looking forward to the month ahead. Today, I want to talk to you about a very specific moment, one that I've experienced myself, and one that so many women that I speak to and coach also experience. It might be dramatic, for example, a layoff or a restructuring or a divorce, a health diagnosis, a promotion opportunity, that suddenly actually feels heavier than exciting. Or it might be a quiet moment, almost hidden, like a slow awareness building inside of you that something no longer fits the way it once did. You might be sitting in a meeting, performing at a high level, saying all the right things, leading effectively, and yet internally you feel disconnected. You might be driving home exhausted, realizing that the energy you once had for your work simply isn't there anymore. Or perhaps you wake up one morning and a persistent thought arrives. I don't know if I want to keep doing this. And instead of getting up, you pull the covers back over your head. Once that thought enters, it never leaves. And what often follows is not immediate clarity. It's not instant excitement about what comes next. What often follows is doubt. Not small doubt, but the kind that questions your foundation. You begin to wonder, if I step away from what I've built, who am I without it? Or, if I try something new, what if I'm discovered I'm not as capable as I thought? Or what if everything I've achieved was only possible in that one environment? This is where a specific form of self-doubt called Imposter Syndrome quietly enters the conversation. Imposter Syndrome is often described as doubting your competence despite clear evidence of success. It's that persistent internal voice suggesting that perhaps you were lucky, perhaps you're not as qualified as others believe, or perhaps if you stretch into something new, you will finally be found out. But here's what I want you to understand very clearly. Imposter syndrome intensifies during transitions, not because you lack ability, but because your identity is shifting. For years and sometimes decades, you may have operated in mastery within a particular environment. You know how to solve problems and you know how to navigate complexity, and you've built credibility. And that mastery builds steadiness and it builds confidence. But when you even consider something new, even something that might be aligned, you leave that steadiness behind and step into beginner energy. And that beginner energy feels very vulnerable. For high-achieving women especially who are accustomed to competence, that vulnerability can feel like regression. It can feel very risky. So your mind does what it's wired to do. It tries to protect you. It suggests that perhaps you're only capable within the narrow lane that you've already proven. and it encourages you to stay where you are validated. It tells you that uncertainty equals danger. But uncertainty does not automatically mean danger. Sometimes it's simply the doorway to growth. There are 3 phases, and I've spoken about this in previous podcasts. I'd like to mention it here again. And that there are 3 phases in every meaningful transition. There's the trigger, there's the in-between phase, and then there's the rebuild or action phase. And the trigger is a moment something shifts, which I just talked about, whether externally or internally. And the rebuild or action phase is it's a visible action phase. It's the new role, it's the new direction, the next step. But it's that in-between phase, I would argue, which is the most important. And it is often the phase where most women try to rush past. The in-between phase is where your old identity is loosening and your new one hasn't fully formed yet. And it can feel ambiguous and unproductive, and even indulgent to sit there and ask these deeper questions of yourself. And because it feels uncertain, there's a strong temptation to move quickly into action. I have seen women who immediately have updated their resumes and begin applying for roles that looked impressive, but did not truly excite them. I've seen women who have accepted promotions because they felt logical, even though their hearts were no longer in that climb. And I've seen women who wanted to pivot entirely but felt paralyzed because they didn't see themselves as credible outside their current or title. And in each case, the core issue wasn't competence, it was clarity. When you move before you're clear, you often recreate the very thing you were trying to leave. Now, I want to acknowledge something important. Real life often requires practicality. Financial responsibilities do not disappear because you're in transition. You may need to continue earning while you figure things out. And that doesn't mean you're stuck. Even within those realities, you can begin investigating possibilities. And this is where understanding your ikigai or reason for being becomes so important. When you understand what energizes you, what you're naturally good at, what feels meaningful for you, and what the world really needs, decisions begin to organize themselves differently. Instead of asking, can I survive outside of what I've always done? You begin asking, how can I use who I am in a way that feels aligned now? I remember very clearly the morning after I left my pharmaceutical career of 25 years. I had reached a level of success that many would have chosen to remain within. And yet I knew that something else was calling me. The very first morning in my new home office was very unnerving. There was no immediate demands. There was no structured calendar or no customers I had to call on, no quotas I had to achieve. It felt freeing, but it also felt very terrifying. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and then I closed it again. I closed my eyes, I took a deep breath, and then I asked myself very honestly, now what? There was some freedom in that question, and there was also fear. When you remove the structure that has defined you for decades, what remains is space. And space can feel deeply uncomfortable if you are not used to occupying it. Imposter syndrome whispered to me too. It asked me whether I had made a mistake, whether my successes had been tied only to that environment, and whether I truly knew how to build something new from scratch. What changed everything was not the absence of doubt, it was the decision not to outrun it. I allowed myself to remain in the in-between phase long enough to ask deeper questions. What actually energizes me? What kind of impact do I want to create in this world? And which parts of my previous career felt most alive, and how can I bring those into this next chapter? And as clarity formed, fear began to shift. It didn't disappear, but it transformed into something more creative and expansive. There were frustrating days, and there still are, and there are still uncertain days. Growth is never linear, but underneath all of it was alignment. Over the last 7 years, I've grown more than I have ever imagined possible, and I'm still growing. We all are. But the fulfillment I experience now is grounded in intention, not expectation. And every uncomfortable moment in that in-between phase was worth it because it allowed me to rebuild from clarity. And I see this pattern again and again in the women who reach out to me. One woman told me, "On paper, everything looks fine. My career is solid. I'm respected. But internally, I feel like I'm shrinking." She wasn't failing. She's just misaligned. Another shared, "I spent 20 years becoming excellent at something I don't actually love. And now I'm terrified that if I leave, I won't be good at anything else." And there are other women who say, "I know I'm capable of more. I can feel it. But every time I think about making a change, I freeze." These are different stories, but the same emotional pattern. I don't want to stay here forever, but I'm not sure I trust myself to move. Once we work together, the shift isn't dramatic at first, it's subtle. We slow down, we separate external expectations from internal truth. We identify what truly energizes them, and that's when energy shifts. They move from catabolic or draining energy, the exhausted drive home, the hiding under the covers, into anabolic or expansive energy, which is possibility-driven energy. And it doesn't mean that fear disappears. It means that fear is no longer in charge. When you begin to see real possibilities for yourself, your posture changes. The conversations you're willing to have change. The risks you're willing to take change. And often opportunities begin appearing that you couldn't have seen before. Not because they weren't there, but because your internal lens has shifted. And this happened to me too. When I started this podcast, I had no idea it would reach women in over 150 countries. When I began coaching, I didn't know how deeply this work would resonate. I did not begin with certainty. I began with clarity. A quiet, grounding understanding of what mattered to me and what no longer did. And from that clarity, confidence grew, not in dramatic leaps and not without moments of frustration, but steadily. It grew each time I took an aligned step, and it grew each time I chose intention over urgency. It grew because I knew why I was moving forward. And I want to invite you into something similar right now. Wherever you're listening from, I'd like you to take a slow breath and simply consider this. What has triggered this questioning for you? What part of your identity feels like it's loosening? And if you're honest with yourself, are you more afraid of failing or letting go of who you've always been? You don't need neat answers in this moment. Just notice what arises and notice what feels true. If you're standing in your own version of that now what space, I want you to consider that the doubt you're feeling may not be a signal to retreat. It may be evidence that you're stretching beyond a version of yourself that is already matured. You have built mastery before. You have learned new skills before. You have grown into roles that you once felt unsure about, and you can do that again. But the order matters. When you take time to clarify before you act, when you align before you accelerate, your next chapter is built on something far more stable than fear. It's built on intention. And if this conversation feels deeply personal, if you recognize yourself in this middle space and sense that you would benefit from thinking through it in a more structured way, then I would genuinely welcome that conversation with you. Not because something is wrong and not because you need it fixing, but because navigating this in-between phase intentionally can change the trajectory of what comes next. You are not an imposter in your next chapter, my friend. You are in transition, and this uncertain middle, uncomfortable as it may feel, may very well be the beginning of something more aligned, more expansive, and more fulfilling than you've ever allowed yourself to imagine. Trust me, it's your time now.